you are looking at a Harley Davidson motorcycle. Let's get into it.
RevelatorAlf.
Hello, welcome to RevelatorAlf. So this video, a quick video, is all about how I'm going to try and convince you that this bike here, the Rieju Marathon 125cc ACSM, is actually a Harley Davidson. You don't believe me? Well, here's my thinking. Many people try and make the distinction between different types of motorcycles, different brands, different manufacturers, when fundamentally there's so many similarities, or actually the components operate in exactly the same way, they look exactly the same, they just might be of different sizes, but essentially they are the same. Get my thinking? Okay. Now, we all know about wheels, okay? Wheels go in the same way, and suspension, yes, up and down type thing. That all kind of works in the same way, for the most part. The frame, yes, the chassis. There are different chassis, of course, and the way they operate. And some are stronger than others, of course. Some allow more flexing. Some chassis incorporate the engine as part of their strength, whereas others actually cradle the engine. So there are differences there, but essentially it's still a chassis, things to bolt onto and to provide rigidity to the motorcycle. In effect, it's the skeleton of the bike. So that's the same for all motorcycles. Okay, so wheels, suspension, chassis, handlebars, brakes, they all operate around about the same principle. Okay, let's talk about the drivetrain, getting the power from the engine to the back wheel. Well, it's either a chain, or it's a belt, or it's a drive shaft, but essentially you're getting power from this point to that point. That's essentially it. Okay, let's just talk about the engine. Now, I'm going to try and convince you now that this is exactly the same as a Harley Davidson engine. Right, or for the most part. First of all, it's air-cooled. That's air-cooled. And how can you tell it's air-cooled? By looking at it? Well, it's got these cooling fins on the side. There we go. That's air-cooled. Second of all, it's got a cam. What? You're saying? Well, yes, most motorcycles operate on the principle of being able to open and close valves at particular points for the combustion chamber, the cylinder, so you can suck in fuel and air and then evacuate it out. That all requires to operate at a certain time. And the amount that the valves open and close at a particular sequence is governed by this cam, which has got teardrop lobes. I'm sure you know what a cam is if you're into Harley Davidson, because there's always a big thing about, oh, I've got to change this cam. Well, this has got a cam. In fact, most motorcycles have cams, but it really depends where that cam is. Now, on Harley Davidsons, traditionally, they are located lower down, right at the base. They are directly turned by the engine, the crank. And then you've got these tappets at the bottom, which are all lifters, really, in the Harley Davidson speak. And then they ride over the cam as the cam is turning, and this lobe, this teardrop, lifts the lifter, the tappet as it were, which is then connected to a rod which goes right up to the top of the engine, and then that rod is connected to a rocker arm, which lifts or twists the rocker arm, and then that is connected to a valve, and that effectively opens and closes the valve. So that is exactly the same here in principle. However, the difference is that my cam is located at the top. So how was that driven? Well, basically it's just got a timing chain. There's a chain directly connected at the base of the engine, for want of a better word, and it goes up to a big timing gear. And as long as everything's all lined up, then the engine, when it's turning, is turning via this chain at the top. The cam, it's an overhead cam. It's overhead the cylinder cam, which then opens and closes the valves, right? You can have these engines with the cam at the bottom, exactly the same as a Harley Davidson. So you see my logic here. There's exactly the same principle, or in some cases exactly the same functionality. Now, the new Revolution Max engines from Harley Davidson are operating with an overhead cam. That's exactly what that is. It's just an overhead cam, and you'll find that they've got a timing chain in it that takes the power effectively from the base of the engine, the crankshaft, all the way to the top of the engine. Exactly the same here. On other engines are like this, which is effectively a Chinese clone of a Honda CG125. You've got the cam at the bottom, right there, exactly the same as a Harley Davidson. So you have lifters, you have push rods, and you have rocker arms at the top. It's exactly the same. So functionality is the same, okay? It might look different, it might have different names, but effectively they're the same. Okay, one of the big things of Harley Davidson, certainly when the M8s were introduced, is a problem with the oil pump. And there's lots of talk of the oil pump not being man enough or woman enough to fulfill the oil pumping requirements of the engine, especially when performance upgrades, stage upgrades were done. So that's why if you do an S&S upgrade, for example, they usually include the updated pump. When you have a stage upgrade on a Harley Davidson, they will say get the pump changed at the same time, and quite rightly. Now that was for earlier versions, and then in later versions they put the uprated oil pump in anyway. Then there's a big talk about, well, what does this oil pump look like? How does it operate? And there's things called gyrotors, where they're basically two cogs. Right? There's an outer cog, for want of a better word, and an inner cog. And I put a picture of one here. So that picture there, that is gyrotors, or inner and outer rotors, okay? And as the rotor spins on the inside, it compresses oil against the outer cog, as it were, and that's what pumps the oil around, and it's pumped all over the engine. Yes? Well, that's not a Harley Davidson oil pump. That's the oil pump from this little 125cc. It's exactly the same. It looks the same. It operates on the same principle, and dare I say it's probably a bit more efficient than the Harley Davidson one. I jest, but it's exactly the same. Now, the way the oil is distributed around the engine, yes, that could be completely different according to what type of engine that you have. Let's say if it is a Harley Davidson with the M8 engine, then primarily the oil pump is pumping oil from the oil that it receives from the oil reservoir, as it were, and then it's pumping it up to the heads and then round and then back down as well. And then it's also getting more oil into the crankcase and scavenging that out as well. So there's different oil lines, as it were. Whereas in this engine, you might have different oil lines completely. It might go into one system, let's say into the crankcase compartment, then it might go into the transmission compartment, so on and so forth. So there might be different chambers which it has to flow through. And there might be an oil filter, an oil strainer at the very end before it goes back into the sump. Well, that's exactly what it is here. Some oil systems operate off a wet sump system, which is basically oil that collects at the bottom and then it's pumped out of there. Some is splash lubricated, so it lubricates everything just by the motion. Other oil systems are governed by a pump, so essentially it is more of a dry sump system as well. Some is a combination of the two. You've got an oil pump with a wet sump system which is collected at the bottom. So it really depends what kind of engine you've got, what kind of lubrication system you've got. But effectively, you've got to have some way of getting oil around the engine and to all those moving parts. All those moving parts create friction, creates heat. What's the purpose of oil? The purpose of oil is effectively to lubricate and cool, really, those parts. Even though you've got an air-cooled engine, just like on a Harley Davidson for the most part, not all the cooling comes from the air. Actually, a fair portion of it comes from the oil itself. So, have I convinced you that this is a Harley Davidson? Well, obviously not. I'm not that naive. But the point of the video is to say, well, you can work on bikes like this and it will give you a really good understanding of your engine or your motorcycle that you're riding now. let's just say that you know, you've got a Harley Davidson, whatever it is. It could be a Sportster, Tourer, whatever. It could be a Japanese motorcycle, a British motorcycle, a European motorcycle. The type of motorcycle doesn't matter. The fundamentals of how they work are very similar, if not the same, and the components that they use, whilst there might be slightly different designs, they either operate in the same principle or they act in exactly the same way, they operate in exactly the same way. So I thought I'd bring this to you to say, well, actually, some of the things which I'm finding here look exactly the same as the components on a Harley Davidson engine I'm talking about, and others are different, of course, because of the nature of the engine. This is a single cylinder for a start, but if it was a twin cylinder, then there'd be more similarities. If it was a V-twin engine, then it would have more similarities as well. But if you just take one cylinder and how that operates, it's virtually exactly the same as a Harley Davidson engine, or any other air-cooled engine, I should say. So there we go, that's it. That is my argument for today. The notion that any motorcycle with an air-cooled engine is actually a Harley Davidson. Let me know what you think. I'm sure you'll disagree, but perhaps some of you might agree with my thinking. Don't forget to subscribe, hit that bell, like and share. Check out the website, RevelatorAlf.com. When I come to split this engine for you, I will be talking a little bit more about this and actually showing you in real time what I'm talking about, what components are exactly the same as any other motorcycle or on a Harley Davidson. Ta-da!